the WNBA, Cathy Engelbart has been cooked. I mean, roasted, sauteed, grilled, however you want to say it.
The WNBA found itself in the middle of a storm after Commissioner Cathy Engelbart made a comment that many saw as degrading toward Caitlin Clark. At a time when Clark has become the face of women's basketball, carrying the league's popularity to new heights. Engelbart's words were not only tone-deaf, but flat-out insulting.
Oh boy. Cathy Engelbart, the WNBA, Caitlin Clark commented, quote, "We need great leadership at this time across all levels. This is the most important time in league's history." Fee said it all. Nafisi Collier said it all.
Instead of celebrating Clark's impact, the commissioner allegedly suggested she should be grateful for what she earns, downplaying the reality that Clark is the single biggest driving force behind ratings, attendance, and merchandise sales. Fans erupted. Media outlets didn't hold back. And then came Caitlin's response, a sharp, unapologetic statement that ripped through Engelbart's authority and left the league reeling. This wasn't just a young star defending herself. This was Caitlin Clark drawing a line in the sand, showing that players will no longer accept being diminished by the very leadership meant to protect them.
Caitlin Clark said she had not heard the story about Cathy Engelbart that Nafisi Collier shared publicly, nor has she heard from Cathy Engelbart since. So Cathy has not reached out to Caitlin to apologize. Cathy has not reached out to Caitlin to dispute the comments was even about her.
The moment that lit the fuse for this firestorm didn't come from a rival player, a hostile fan, or even a critic in the media. It came directly from the league's highest office, Commissioner Cathy Engelbart. During what should have been a routine discussion about the state of the WNBA and its rising stars, Engelbart reportedly made a remark that Caitlin Clark should be grateful for the opportunities and income she was already receiving. To the casual listener, this might have seemed like a throwaway line. But for those paying close attention, it carried the weight of years of frustration, condescension, and dismissal that women's basketball players have endured.
So congratulations, Cathy. You now have Scott Van Pelt destroying you.
As for what Engelbart is alleged to have said to Collier, if she actually suggested Caitlin Clark should be grateful for what she makes off the court, that's preposterous. Did you miss the Iowa years? Clark is the Tiger Woods tide that lifts all boats, and we know this show is proof. The highest rating we have ever had followed one of her games at Iowa. The WNBA has benefited from her presence more than the other way around, even though this year for Caitlin Clark was essentially lost to injury.
Clark, who has single-handedly elevated ratings, filled arenas, and generated buzz that the WNBA has struggled to capture for decades, suddenly found herself being minimized by the very leader tasked with maximizing her impact. The comment wasn't just out of touch, it was degrading. It implied that Clark, despite transforming the economics of the league, should accept the crumbs she was given without question. Fans immediately took to social media, pointing out the absurdity. Why should the league's biggest draw be told to be grateful when her presence alone had skyrocketed franchise valuations, TV deals, and overall relevance? The backlash wasn't confined to online chatter. Journalists and analysts quickly picked up the story. Sports talk shows replayed the comment, dissecting its meaning and asking a brutal question. How could a commissioner publicly diminish her biggest star at such a critical time?
According to Sportico, franchise valuations have soared. Players want more money and the CBA expires at the end of this month. This was a whole lot more than just a shot across the bow. The WNBA Finals begin this Friday, and we typically hear from Adam Silver on the eve of the NBA Finals. Cathy Engelbart has got to do more than say she's disheartened in a press release. The commissioner needs to explain.
For many, it felt like Engelbart had revealed what she truly thought, that players were replaceable, even someone as impactful as Clark. But that was far from reality. Clark's supporters began comparing her influence to legends of other sports. Just as Tiger Woods transformed golf and Serena Williams redefined tennis, Caitlin Clark is reshaping women's basketball. Yet, unlike Woods or Williams, Clark faces a commissioner who seems unwilling to embrace that transformation. The contrast was glaring. In other sports, leaders bend over backwards to support their superstars, knowing their presence grows the entire ecosystem. In the WNBA, Engelbart's words seemed to suggest that Clark owed the league more than the league owed her.
As a commissioner, that shit would have worked before Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese came into the WNBA. That shit you probably had that already blueprinted up to tell them every time they got the talking. These girls, those two girls, came into the WNBA retiring their parents. Do you think their $60,000 money, do they give two shits about? They were in college as millionaires.
This dynamic struck a nerve not only because of what was said, but because of what it represented. It symbolized the tension between a new generation of athletes demanding respect and an old guard of leadership clinging to outdated attitudes. For players like Clark, who already had financial success and cultural relevance before entering the league, being told to be grateful rang hollow. She didn't need the WNBA as much as the WNBA needed her. That reality made Engelbart's remark even more tone-deaf. The outrage swelled, and it was clear this wasn't just going to pass quietly. Clark had a choice: stay silent and let the insult slide, or speak out and confront the commissioner head-on. She chose the latter, and when she did, the league would never be the same.
She also did say she hadn't heard the story Nafisa shared on Cathy Engelbart said about her. Hasn't heard from Engelbart since. Your commissioner did not reach out to the most popular superstar in women's sports. The commissioner didn't call her about this.
When Caitlin Clark finally addressed the commissioner's words, she didn't do it with subtlety or hesitation. She spoke with the confidence of someone who knows her worth and isn't afraid to defend it. Clark made it clear that being told to be grateful was not just insulting to her personally, but degrading to the entire women's basketball movement that has fought for decades to be taken seriously. For Clark, this wasn't about pride, it was about respect. Her response cut straight to the heart of the issue. She has carried the WNBA into mainstream conversation in a way that few, if any, players ever have. Ratings spike when she plays. Arenas sell out when she's in town. Merchandise featuring her name outsells almost every other athlete in the league. By highlighting these undeniable facts, Clark essentially put Engelbart on notice. The commissioner's words weren't just wrong. They ignored reality. Clark also made sure her message resonated beyond herself. She framed the commissioner's comment as an insult to every player working tirelessly to build the game. By suggesting that players should simply be grateful, Engelbart had undermined the struggles, sacrifices, and progress of generations of women athletes. Clark reminded everyone that gratitude isn't the issue. Accountability is. Players are grateful, but they're also demanding fair treatment, transparency, and leadership that recognizes their value. That, she emphasized, is the real conversation. The power of her statement was amplified because she didn't come across as bitter or angry. Instead, she was calm, sharp, and devastatingly precise. It wasn't a rant. It was a dismantling piece by piece of the commissioner's credibility. Fans and media outlets immediately picked up on the gravity of her words. Clips of her response spread across social platforms, with headlines declaring that Clark had destroyed Engelbart with nothing more than the truth. Even more striking was how other athletes rallied behind her. Stars from both the WNBA and beyond echoed her points, praising her courage for speaking up. In a league where players often fear backlash from management, Clark had broken the silence, setting a precedent that others could follow. For many, it felt like a turning point, a moment where the players' voices finally carried more weight than the commissioner's office. Clark's words didn't just sting Engelbart. They exposed the widening gap between the league's leadership and its players. Fans began questioning how long Engelbart could realistically remain in charge when the face of the league had just publicly dismantled her authority. What Clark accomplished in a single statement was something years of criticism hadn't managed. She made Engelbart look out of touch, weak, and expendable. But this was only the beginning. The moment Clark pushed back, the media saw blood in the water. Analysts, commentators, and talk show hosts would soon pile on, taking the controversy to levels Engelbart could never have anticipated. And the noise was about to get deafening. Once Caitlin Clark's response spread across the sports world, the story grew far beyond her words. It wasn't just a feud between a superstar and the commissioner anymore, it became the centerpiece of national sports media. The moment journalists and TV hosts picked up the controversy, it snowballed into a public reckoning for Cathy, Engelbart, and the league's leadership. Stephen A. Smith was one of the first heavy hitters to weigh in, and he did so with the blunt force he's known for. He called Engelbart's response weak and openly questioned how someone so detached from her players could lead the league into its most crucial era. To millions of viewers, Stephen A. didn't just critique Engelbart's words, he exposed them as proof of a leadership crisis. His rant set the tone, making it clear this wasn't going away anytime soon. Other media voices quickly followed. Christine Brennan appeared on CNN, emphasizing the fallout from Engelbart's comment and pointing out how the WNBA's credibility was crumbling at a time when it should be thriving. She highlighted how dismissive remarks toward Clark weren't just bad optics, they were terrible business. In her words, the WNBA had the perfect storm for growth with Caitlin Clark, yet leadership was fumbling the opportunity. Her analysis resonated with fans who already suspected the league wasn't fully embracing its biggest star. Talk shows, podcasts, and sports columns latched onto the storyline. Headlines screamed that Engelbart had disrespected Clark and potentially sabotaged the league's momentum. Social media clips of analysts discussing the issue went viral, stacking millions of views. Even critics who had little interest in the WNBA before suddenly joined the debate, if only because the drama was too big to ignore. What made the pylon especially damaging was the unity of the narrative. Typically, media debates split into factions. But here, the majority of voices landed on the same conclusion. Caitlin Clark was right, and Engelbart was wrong. The commissioner had mishandled her words, mishandled her response, and mishandled the league's most important player, with every article, every hot take, every podcast rant. Engelbart's authority weakened further. Fans noticed the shift immediately. Instead of defending Engelbart, the public overwhelmingly sided with Clark. Comment sections flooded with support for her, while hashtags calling for Engelbart's resignation trended on Twitter and Instagram. The perception had flipped. What was once a commissioner versus player disagreement had become a battle for the soul of the league, and Engelbart was losing badly. The piling on didn't just damage Engelbart's image, it magnified the gap between leadership and reality. If every major media figure, every fan online, and even former players all agreed that Clark was carrying the league, then how could Engelbart justify her dismissive stance? The commissioner wasn't just isolated, she was cornered, and the next layer of criticism would hit where it hurt most, the league's ratings and financial future. Because once numbers entered the conversation, Engelbart's position became almost impossible to defend. As the media frenzy grew, analysts began pulling out the numbers, and that's when Engelbart's position became even harder to defend. It wasn't just about hurt feelings or a poorly chosen comment anymore. The cold, hard ratings made it clear. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another player. She was the economic lifeline of the WNBA, and by downplaying her influence, Engelbart had effectively undermined the league's most valuable asset. Last year, when Clark was still a rookie making her playoff debut, the WNBA saw record-breaking viewership. Her second playoff game peaked at over 3 million viewers, shattering expectations and putting the league in the spotlight like never before. Compare that to this season. When Clark was sidelined with injury and missed key matchups, ratings dropped to nearly half those numbers. Instead of soaring momentum, the league was struggling to stay above 1 million viewers for crucial playoff games. That drop wasn't just embarrassing. It was devastating for sponsors, networks, and ownership groups who had invested heavily in the WNBA's growth. ESPN, ABC, and other broadcast partners had signed on for a product that Caitlin Clark made marketable. Without her, the league suddenly looked fragile, unable to sustain mainstream interest. The optics were brutal. One player made the WNBA matter on the national stage, and that same player was being told by her commissioner to simply be grateful. The financial implications went beyond TV ratings. Ticket sales told the same story. Whenever Clark played on the road, arenas filled up with sellout crowds. Fans drove hours to watch her, and secondary ticket markets saw prices spike in cities that rarely drew attention before. Merchandise sales, too, were heavily tilted in her favor. Jerseys with her name, outsold nearly every other player combined, giving the WNBA a revenue stream it hadn't seen in years. Sponsors also recognized her value. Clark's association with Nike and other major brands brought credibility and attention that transcended women's basketball. She had crossover appeal, attracting not only die-hard WNBA fans, but also casual sports viewers and even people who hadn't followed basketball at all before her arrival. This kind of cultural influence is priceless, and yet it was being dismissed by leadership at the very top. Critics hammered Engelbart with these points repeatedly. If the league's health depended on Clark's presence, then undermining her wasn't just short-sighted, it was reckless. Commentators framed Engelbart's stance as a commissioner biting the hand that feeds her. Jeopardizing long-term growth for the sake of outdated attitudes, the narrative became impossible to escape. Without Clark, the WNBA struggled. With her, the league had historic momentum. Every number, every statistic, every trend line pointed to the same conclusion. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another star. She was the difference between irrelevance and relevance, between struggling and thriving. And yet, instead of embracing her fully, Engelbart had alienated her. That disconnect was no longer just a public relations problem. It was a financial crisis. And as media voices pointed out, it wasn't just about ratings. The controversy was beginning to seep into the locker room itself, sparking deeper divisions among players. While the numbers proved Caitlin Clark's unmatched value to the league, the fallout from Engelbart's degrading comment cut deeper than business. It struck at the heart of the locker room, where players were already navigating tension over Clark's rise and the spotlight she commanded. For some, Engelbart's grateful remark validated their frustrations, while for others, it highlighted just how out of touch league leadership had become. Either way, it intensified divides that had been simmering all season. From the beginning of Clark's rookie campaign, it was obvious she wasn't just another newcomer. Her presence shifted the balance of attention. Crowds cheered louder for her than for veterans who had carried the league for years. Endorsements and sponsorships seemed to line up behind her in a way they hadn't for others. That naturally bred resentment, even among players who respected her skill. Many felt the league was becoming the Caitlin Clark show, and Engelbart's remark only poured fuel on that narrative. But here's where it became messy. Instead of diffusing the tension, Engelbart's words divided players further. To Clark's defenders, the commissioner's comment was insulting not only to Caitlin, but to all athletes who had fought for legitimacy in women's sports. These players saw Clark as a symbol of progress, proof that women's basketball could finally attract mainstream attention and money. To minimize her was to minimize everything they'd worked toward. On the other hand, some players quietly welcomed Engelbart's remark. For those who felt overshadowed, hearing the commissioner downplay Clark's influence almost sounded like validation, as if the league itself was reminding everyone that no one player was bigger than the whole. Yet that attitude clashed with the reality of the numbers. Everyone could see Clark's impact, and pretending otherwise didn't bring balance, it created denial. Napheesa Collier, one of the league's most respected voices, made it clear she hadn't even heard from Engelbart during key moments, which only emphasized the disconnect. If the commissioner couldn't build trust with veterans or with the league's brightest star, then who exactly was she leading? That question lingered in every locker room, fueling whispers that the leadership vacuum at the top was as damaging as the physical battles on the court. Fans picked up on the tension. 2. Social media amplified every clip of a hard foul against Clark, every side-eye from an opponent, every subtle remark in post-game interviews. Narratives of jealousy and resentment became part of the conversation, whether fair or not. Instead of presenting a united front, the WNBA looked fractured, with its players caught between resentment of Clark's fame and recognition that she was the reason for the league's growing popularity. Engelbart's role in that fracture couldn't be ignored. Her comment may have been aimed at Clark, but the ripple effects spread through every locker room. Leadership had failed to protect the league's biggest star, and failed to unify the players under a shared vision. And if that wasn't damaging enough, the national spotlight was about to crank up the pressure even further. ESPN and major outlets were ready to magnify the chaos, taking Engelbart's problems from internal whispers to primetime headlines. Once the locker room tension spilled into the public conversation, the national media seized on the story with full force. What had started as a single degrading remark now became a symbol of everything wrong with Cathy Engelbart's leadership. ESPN, CNN, Sports Illustrated, and countless podcasts placed the commissioner under the harshest spotlight she had faced since taking office. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Caitlin Clark anymore, it was about whether Engelbart could survive as commissioner at all. ESPN's coverage was especially brutal. Scott Van Pelt used his flagship SportsCenter segment to deliver what many fans described as a career-ending monologue aimed directly at Engelbart. He pointed out the absurdity of a commissioner telling Caitlin Clark to be grateful when she had single-handedly lifted the WNBA's profile to historic heights. Van Pelt highlighted how Clark's social media following alone outpaced the entire league's official account. A stunning fact that underscored just how much Engelbart had underestimated her star. His words were devastating because they came with irrefutable evidence. The league wasn't boosting Clark. Clark was boosting the league. Other outlets piled on with similar critiques. CNN framed Engelbart as tone-deaf at the worst possible time, noting that dismissing the league's most valuable player during critical CBA negotiations showed not only poor judgment but outright incompetence. Sports blogs and YouTube channels ran with the story as well, amplifying Clark's response and framing Engelbart as the villain holding women's basketball back. The story transcended sports pages and entered mainstream headlines, becoming a cultural talking point about leadership, gender equity, and respect for athletes. What made the media backlash especially lethal was the timing. The WNBA was in the middle of trying to position itself for growth, with franchise valuations climbing and new sponsorships lining up. Instead of celebrating momentum, the league was forced to answer questions about whether its commissioner had alienated the very star fueling that success. Every press release, every statement from Engelbart's office sounded weak compared to the tidal wave of criticism. Fans weren't silent either. Hashtags calling for Engelbart's resignation trended repeatedly, with clips of analysts and players criticizing her gaining millions of views across TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. The league's PR team could not spin away from the reality that the public overwhelmingly sided with Caitlin Clark. Every time, Engelbart tried to defend herself with soft statements. Fans mocked her tone and demanded accountability. By now, the pressure wasn't only external. NBA executives, many of whom had invested in or overseen WNBA franchises, were watching closely. They understood Clark's value in a way Engelbart seemed not to. The more media amplified the story, the more it became clear that Engelbart's leadership wasn't just in question, it was crumbling in real time. And just when the firestorm seemed like it couldn't grow hotter, whispers began to circulate. Some weren't just calling for Engelbart to apologize, they were calling for her removal altogether. And those whispers were about to get louder, fueled by powerful voices with influence far beyond the WNBA. By the time the media had finished tearing Engelbart apart, the conversation shifted from criticism to something far more serious: removal. What began as outrage over a single comment had snowballed into widespread doubt about whether Cathy Engelbart could survive as commissioner. Fans were openly demanding change, players were questioning her leadership, and the press was circling like sharks. But the most significant pressure came from a place she couldn't ignore: the NBA itself. The WNBA has always leaned heavily on its parent league for stability, visibility, and funding. That tie has its advantages, but it also means the NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, has an outsized influence on the WNBA's future. And Silver, along with NBA team owners who also controlled WNBA franchises, had been watching closely. The degrading comment about Caitlin Clark wasn't just a PR nightmare, it was a business liability. Clark wasn't simply a player, she was a financial engine. Jeopardizing her relationship with the league was seen as a direct threat to revenue streams. Whispers started circulating that Engelbart's job might be on the chopping block. League insiders reported growing frustration among WNBA owners who believed she had lost credibility with both players and fans. A commissioner can survive criticism, but when sponsors, networks, and ownership groups start questioning their leadership, the clock begins to tick. Engelbart's silence after the backlash, followed by her tepid, disheartened response, only deepened the impression that she was incapable of steering the league through crisis. Players weren't helping her case either. Napheesa Collier's revelation that she hadn't even heard from Engelbart during key moments raised alarms about player relations. If the commissioner couldn't connect with her veterans and couldn't protect her stars, what value did she bring? Caitlin Clark's response had already destroyed her credibility in the court of public opinion. But now, Engelbart was losing ground inside the league itself. The looming CBA negotiations poured gasoline on the fire. Players were demanding better pay, improved travel accommodations, and a bigger share of the league's rising value. How could Engelbart possibly negotiate in good faith after insulting the very players she was supposed to represent? Any deal she tried to strike would be viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility. This raised the question of whether the WNBA could move forward with her at the helm. And then came the ultimate wildcard, Adam Silver. The NBA commissioner had already shown frustration with the WNBA's decision-making when Clark was left off the Olympic roster, a massive marketing blunder. If Silver believed Engelbart was standing in the way of maximizing Clark's star power, he had both the leverage and the motive to push for change. Rumors swirled that NBA leadership was quietly evaluating options, considering whether a new commissioner could better capitalize on the momentum Clark had created. By now, it wasn't a matter of if Engelbart could recover. It was a matter of when the pressure would become too much. The calls for her resignation were growing louder by the day, and the NBA's influence loomed over the entire situation. The question on everyone's mind was clear. Could Cathy Engelbart survive this storm? Or was her time as commissioner already over? And with the league's credibility and future hanging in the balance, the answer seemed closer than ever. By the time the dust settled, Cathy Engelbart was no longer just battling public criticism. She was facing an existential threat to her position as commissioner. The degrading comment toward Caitlin Clark had turned into a rallying cry across the league, uniting fans, players, and media voices in rare agreement. What started as a misstep had snowballed into a full-blown crisis that could define the WNBA's future. The calls for Engelbart's resignation were no longer whispers. They had become thunderous demands. Fans used hashtags like #RemoveEngelbart and #ClarkDeservesBetter, which trended repeatedly across social platforms. Sports talk radio hosts openly debated who might replace her. Even insiders who once defended her leadership admitted privately that her credibility had been shattered. Once a commissioner loses the trust of both her players and her public, survival becomes nearly impossible. But it wasn't just about perception, it was about timing. The WNBA was approaching a critical crossroads with the collective bargaining agreement set to expire. The league needed a leader who could negotiate with players, secure long-term sponsorships, and maintain momentum during a historic growth window. Engelbart's comment made it clear she was out of step with her athletes. How could she represent them at the bargaining table when they no longer respected her authority? Every failed statement and defensive press release only made that question louder. Behind the scenes, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver's influence loomed large. Silver had already been frustrated by Engelbart's decision-making, especially the Olympic snub that left Caitlin Clark off the roster, a marketing disaster that cost women's basketball a golden opportunity. He had the power to influence ownership and steer the conversation toward change. League insiders speculated that Silver might already be preparing for a transition. Recognizing that Clark's stardom required a commissioner willing to embrace her fully at the same time, sponsors and networks quietly pressured the league. They had invested in Clark's star power, building advertising campaigns and promotional strategies around her presence. The idea that the commissioner herself had undermined that star left many corporate partners uneasy. If Clark was the league's ticket to mainstream relevance, then Engelbart was now seen as a liability standing in the way. The narrative became unavoidable. The WNBA had reached a breaking point. Engelbart's leadership wasn't just questioned, it was collapsing in real time. Her defenders were few, her critics were everywhere, and the players she was supposed to lead had already moved on emotionally. What Caitlin Clark did, with one sharp, unapologetic response, was expose a truth the league could no longer ignore. Respect cannot be demanded from players. It must be earned. Engelbart had lost that respect, and now the WNBA faced its most pressing question: or embrace change before the league's most important opportunity slipped away forever. Either way, the storm had changed everything. There would be no going back. The fallout from Cathy Engelbart's degrading remark toward Caitlin Clark was more than just a controversy. It was a turning point. Clark's fearless response ripped away the illusion of stability and forced the league to confront its biggest problem: leadership that doesn't understand the value of its own stars. The numbers don't lie. Clark is the engine of ticket sales, ratings, and merchandise. And she's the reason sponsors and fans are paying attention like never before. To minimize her wasn't just disrespectful, it was reckless. Engelbart now stands at the center of a storm she created, with players, fans, and media demanding accountability. The WNBA is at a crossroads. It can either embrace the generational star who has lifted it into the spotlight, or cling to a commissioner who has already lost the locker room, the media, and the fans. One way or another, change feels inevitable.